bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the October 22nd, 2024 podcast. One of the subjects we follow very closely here on Tax Credit Tuesday is rent and income limits for long-lasting tax credit finance properties. As our regular listeners know, maximum income limits for LIHTC properties are set by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. HUD releases the limits annually around April 1st in recent years. HUD's income limits are used by property owners to calculate the highest annual income a tenant can have and still qualify to rent a long-lasting tax credit finance apartment. HUD's income limits are also used to calculate the maximum rent a tenant can charge for a long-lasting tax credit unit. Now, as I said frequently on this podcast and elsewhere, no one outside of HUD knows more about HUD's income limits than my guest today, Thomas Stagg. And if you're watching on YouTube, you already see that Thomas is my guest today. Thomas is here to share his insights as to what we know today about what next year's, that's 2025's, income limits are likely to look like. Those income limits are expected to be released around April 1, 2025. There are many variables that are included in HUD's calculation of income limits, and these variables are drawn from various government data releases that occur in between the annual income releases. And there are three key variables I want to highlight during this podcast. First, there is the 1-year American Community Survey data for 2023. The Census Bureau released this data about a month ago on September 12th. So we have key additional information about what the 2025 calculation will include. Second, there's HUD-determined fair market rents. HUD-determined fair market rents are HUD's estimate of the 40th percentile of market rate rents for an area. 40th percentile market rate rents, what does that mean? Well, simply said, that means 60% of units are above that rent level in a given area and 40% are below. Now, the HUD published fair market rents are used by public housing authorities to set the maximum rent the housing authority will reimburse under a Section 8 voucher. HUD did release the 2025 fair market rents a couple of months ago in August. And that does go into the calculation of income levels for a number of areas in the country by HUD. Now, third is the estimated consumer price index for 2025. Now, for this, HUD uses a Congressional Budget Office estimate of future CPI, and that CPI estimate that HUD uses, we expect to be released in early 2025. So that is one, I mentioned three factors, two of the three we have, one of the three we're still waiting on. Now, based on the two variables that we do have data for, there is a considerable amount that we can say, or at least that Thomas can say, about 2025 income limits. And Thomas is on the podcast to share his thoughts about those limits. But not only is he on to talk about that, we have a couple of bonus topics. Thomas is also going to discuss small area per market rents and the expansion of areas using them, as well as the recently enacted rent control for all long-lasting tax credit properties in California. So as you can see, there's a lot to share, and Thomas always has interesting insights. So if you're ready, let's get started. Thomas, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Hey, Mike, good to be back.
This is your 14th appearance on the podcast.
But who's counting, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. That makes you one of 5 people with double figures in appearances. So I appreciate you being back. Now, before we launch into rent income limits, as well as small area fair market rents and rent control in California for LIHTC properties, I wanted you to share with our audience some of the services you provide in Novogradac clients.
Yeah, so Mike, I work mainly with developers, but for my developer clients, I do a lot of different stuff. Obviously, I do audit and tax work for operating properties as well as final cost certifications. But my team also does a lot of application work in various states, helping people apply for credits and helping people stay in compliance by doing compliance monitoring. So if you're a developer, I'm really kind of your one-stop soup to nuts person who's going to be able to help you with everything that you're working on at your project.
Great. Thank you for that, Thomas. Now let's dive into rent and income limits. And I say rent and income limits, but HUD releases income limits. And so those income limits that get used by owners to calculate the maximum income levels of qualifying tenants, as well as the maximum rents that they can charge. So sometimes we might say HUD rent and income limits. Know that we know that HUD issues the income limits. But let's talk about the two data releases. The Census Bureau released the 1-year ACS data, American Community Survey data. So we might say ACS, that's that acronym, or initialism, not an acronym. They released that data for 2023 on September 12th of last month. And then a month before that, on August 14th, HUD released the fair market rents. So just to maybe level set, if you could explain how the ACS data and the fair market rents factor into the rent and income limit calculations.
Yeah. So when HUD is looking at doing their income limit calculations, they start with American Community Survey data. So American Community Survey data, I like to think of it as a mini census. So it's done on an annual basis, and they send surveys out to tenants throughout the year, not tenants, sorry, to households and individuals throughout the year. And they collect key demographic information. And some of that information they collect is what that tenant's income or what that household's income is. And so they collect that survey, and then HUD takes that survey data and uses the most recent survey to estimate, I should say, income limits. So for 2025 income limits, they're going to use the 2023 American Community Survey that was just released. Now, you might say, why are we using 2023 for 2025? But remember, this survey is conducted all throughout 2023. And in fact, the respondents have until April of 2023 to respond. So then Census has to take that data, compile it, and they don't release it until September. And then HUD takes that data and quickly implements it into their calculation for the 2025 data. And now, of course, that census data or that American Community Survey data is old, right? It's 3 years old, 2 years old, I guess now. And so they have to have a way to kind of trend that forward to the income year. And that's where that CPI factor comes into play. So they take that ACS data, they use a CPI factor to trend it forward, and that determines what we call area median income. But for tax credit projects, we actually use something called very low income. And so to go from area median income, AMI, to VLI, very low income, HUD has these series of adjustments that they apply. And one of those adjustments is the high housing cost adjustment. And the high housing cost adjustment is based on fair market rents. And HUD uses the fair market rents to kind of look at an area and say, based on these rents, are tenants paying an exceptionally high percentage of their income towards rent? And if so, we need to artificially inflate the income limit so that more people can qualify for housing. So the fair market rents are a very key part of determining VLI. And every year there's a handful of areas that have this high housing cost adjustment where they have their income limits not based on this American Community Survey data or AMI, but actually based on fair market rents.
Great. Thank you for that. No one can explain that better than you can. So I'm sure our listeners appreciate it and our viewers as well. So now I feel like you should share the big reveal, because now that we have the data that came out for 2023, you're then able to get some initial sense as to what average increases we might see in very low income levels, as well as what the cap might be.
Yeah, right. So we take this data and we calculate what we call our Novogradac income and rent limit estimator. And using this data, we're actually able to currently estimate the income and rent limits for 1,469 areas. But those 1,469 areas cover 82% of the population. And we're not able to do every area, partially due to some of the adjustments that HUD does that we're unable to recalculate, and partially because some areas use 5-year American Community Survey data that won't be out till December. So in December, we will update our estimate and try and pick up some more areas. But of these roughly 1,500 areas that we can estimate, when we look at national median income, so we take the data and we start running it through our estimator here, right? So if we look big picture, national median income at the ACS level increased by 4.62%. So that tells us a couple things. One, it tells us that, okay, ACS data had a kind of nice steady increase to it. But number two, more importantly for our listeners who have listened to many of our conversations over the last few years, it tells us what the cap is going to be on income limit increases for 2025, because that cap is 2 times the change in the national median income at the ACS level. And so therefore, we know at this point that the cap next year will be 9.2%. And I'm just going to do one caveat here that's going to kind of cover us for the rest of the podcast. When I say we know subject to HUD not changing their methodology, right? HUD could change the cap as they've done in the past, but based on HUD not changing their methodology, and we'll talk later why I don't foresee any big changes this year. But assuming HUD sticks with their methodology, we know the cap next year is going to be 9.2%. But looking back at our ACS data now, it said ACS went up by 4.6%. So you're probably thinking, well, that means income limits are going to increase by at least 4.6%, or at least we would hope that would be true. But actually, that's not true this year, because as we talked about earlier, from that ACS data, HUD applies this trend factor. And the trend factor actually becomes very important this year because the trend factor is based on consumer price index. And if you've been following anything, you know that consumer price index is still going up. But thankfully for many consumers, it's going up at a slower rate than it's been going up for the last few years. So even though this adjustment's still a positive adjustment, it's a slower positive adjustment than we've had in past years. And so if you think about that, if we're trending at a slower rate, that's going to slow down this estimate of HUD. The way I like to think about it is, if your American Community Survey data stayed flat, and let's just use $50,000 as a nice round number, last year's trend factor was roughly 1.06. So you would have been trended to 53,000 last year. Now, if your ACS stayed flat, this year's trend factor is right around 1.05. So you'd be trended to 52,250. So you'd have a decrease in your income limit because the trend factor is slower. So said another way, this serves as a headwind for income limit increases. So if your area went up by 4.6% on average, the trend factor is a headwind slowing you down. And so the average increase in AMI is actually just under 3% for this year. But as we discussed earlier, AMI is not where we stop, right? We want to understand VLI for our tax credit properties. And so very low income, as we talked about, has these adjustments that HUD applies. And surprisingly, after we do all these adjustments, VLI is actually growing at an even slower rate. It's growing at 2.87% across, the roughly 1,500 areas that we can estimate. Now, if we kind of look at trend, okay, so let's let that marinate for a second. So slightly less than 3% increase in very low income. That means kind of on average across the country, you're going to have a slightly less than 3% increase in the amount in the rent that you can charge to residents. Now, the good news on that is hopefully our models were kind of estimating somewhere between 2.5% and 3% growth when we're underwriting projects. So we're still kind of in that realm of what people were anticipating for growth, but it's definitely slower than we've been seeing in the last couple of years. But there's some good news out of this. Number one is when we actually do a weighted average increase based on population. So we kind of weight the larger areas a little heavier in this average. Our average increase is closer to 4%. And so we're seeing that the larger areas are tending to grow a little bit faster than some of the smaller areas. And when we look at it, we see that 11% of the areas, roughly 58% of the population of the US, has an increase over 9%. So we're still going to have some areas that are having kind of very large increases. But on the flip side, and this is the bigger change from the last couple of years, is 25% of the areas, which covers around 40% of the population, including one very large metropolitan area on the East Coast, actually is estimated to have a decrease this year. And then if we look at the average increase of the 10 largest areas, that average increase is 6.26%. And so large areas are tending to do a little bit better, smaller areas a little bit less. But again, this is why this estimator tool I think is so important, is these sweeping averages are great, but where do you fall in this range is much more important to you, right?
That's right. You don't live in the average.
Yeah.
So you mentioned how important the specific, how the averages are one thing and they're the top line number, and that's what people talk about. But you explained how divergent the actual numbers are on given areas, and you just talked about regions. And one of the reasons why you created the rent and income limit estimator was in response to client requests, is that they wanted to know about what the future income was going to be in a given area. So they could be estimating the number of qualifying tenants as well as what the rent levels are likely to be. And generally speaking, you can do this over 2 years. Maybe explain a little bit more for listeners and those viewing some of the benefits of being able to estimate what the inflows are going to be over the next couple of years.
Yeah. So we see our clients using this for lots of different reasons. But one of the biggest reasons we see people approaching us for this is when they're looking at doing a new project and they're wondering, okay, how much are rents growing in the future? That helps them understand how viable this project is. If this is a good decision to build a project here, if we're estimating, this area is going to have decreases. Obviously, you look at your budget a little tighter than you would if we're saying, no, this area is going to have a 9% increase next year. And so it really helps kind of upfront in budgeting. But then at the same time, even midlife cycle during that construction period, as you're starting to get your final cost in and maybe having cost overruns, as we saw the last few years, or increase in interest rates, which hopefully are going away. But it helps you understand, are we able to maybe do an earn out on our debt or have more supportable permanent debt to cover these cost overruns or just to make our project work more efficiently than it maybe did when we initially underwrite it? So I'd say our first power users are kind of these developers that are really want to understand their project better. And this is one key piece of information that helps them underwrite better. And then we look at property managers and owners who are kind of looking out at their existing portfolio and looking at budgeting and saying, okay, we're going to have a big increase in income limits. Can I now spend more on doing more maintenance at our property? Can we do some improvements? Can we do some maybe deferred maintenance that hopefully we've worked our way through post-COVID, but during COVID, we had some deferred maintenance. Do these increasing rents help us increase that? But also knowing early helps you kind of make a plan for how this might impact your tenants and what properties you're looking at saying, we're not going to take this to max because of this tenant population. And you can start formulating ideas early how you're going to kind of message this to your residents, because residents like to know information as early as possible because this is a big factor to them. So budgeting, hiring, right? Determining if you're going to hire more support staff at the project. And then also kind of, as we kind of talk through the life cycle is how I think about it. When we get towards the end of the life cycle, if you're looking at selling your portfolio or somebody's looking at buying properties, understanding the rent growth in an area can really have a big impact on that, how much you're willing to pay. I almost said cap rate, but your income that's being used towards that cap rate, kind of that terminal value. And then, of course, we have investors that are using it to kind of understand the market dynamics around. They might have a lot of projects that they've invested in and lenders in areas that we're showing decreases. So do they start getting their workout group aware of this? Do they start reaching out to people early proactively to say, hey, how are we budgeting for this next year? Because there's a mismatch, right? We budget in December, but income limits come out in April. And so have we mismatched our budget? So this helps us in that cycle as well.
No, thank you for that. I mean, there's so many ways that it's helpful. And I always think of from a development perspective, if you look at the income limits and you expect there to be an increased income limit such that your tenants, you can charge those sort of higher tenants, there'll be first time tenants there. You can expect that your rent amount that you can borrow will be higher. But the opposite's true as well. If you're not going to see the increase, you need to make sure you're not budgeting in any growth in incomes because you're not going to have that additional cash flow to borrow. Anyways, I appreciate you summarizing all of that, but it does, I want to go on to fair market rents, but when you mentioned how, HUD takes the 2023 data and then uses that for 2025 rents as we've talked, or income levels as we've talked about. Now that the 2023 data has come out, back in 2021, back in 2023, I should say, the 2021 data was used to estimate 2023. And if I remember correctly, they were going to use 2020, but because the data was bad because of COVID, they switched to 2 year versus 3 years. So 2021, they took the 2021 data and projected it forward to 2023. now that we have the 2023 data, we can compare and see how well HUD did.
Yeah.
Please.
If I didn't run the numbers myself, I almost wouldn't believe it. So, right in March 15 of 2023, no, sorry, May 15th, HUD released their estimate for 2023 incomes, and their national median income was 96,200, $96,200. And the ACS data that came out last month showed national median income for 2023 of $96,400. So a 0.2% variance. So you would, if you saw only this year, you would think that HUD really has this dialed in, figured out. And HUD does think a lot about this, and they do try and dial it in and figure it out. But this is an anomaly. HUD historically has not been this right on with their estimates. If we kind of look back over the last 3-4 years, that variance has been a little bit higher. HUD has actually been underestimating their income compared to what ACS came out to be. And so they've been, if you look at it, it's about 3% on average low when we look at the national median income that HUD estimated and the national median income in the ACS data. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that especially the kind of years that we're cherry picking here are years that there was COVID influence, there was post-COVID influence and things like that. But historically, HUD's estimate's been a little low, but this year they've really, it was very, well, I should say 2023, it was very, very close, which I found somewhat surprising.
What it also reinforces perhaps the wisdom of HUD, because they, before 2023, would use 3 years. They'd go back 3 years. So they added an extra
Yeah,
year of variability.
right.
And we were wondering if since they couldn't use the 2020 data for COVID, would they then revert back to 3 years? The fact that they decided to stay with 2, it does take an extra year off of a risk of variability in
Yeah,
terms of that. And just as you explained pretty well at the beginning, it's really all about the fact that they're projecting forward based upon CPI. And then you have to then wait and see how well income levels actually rose compared to CPI.
right. That's always been the question is CPI, is that increase actually being pushed down to wages, or is it going
Right.
somewhere else in the system? And for 2023, at least, it would appear that increase in CPI did equate to increased wages at the median income level.
Right. It also just reminds me that when you're doing the estimates for the rent income estimator, until we get the data, next year that the CBO releases, we have to kind of use a proxy for the CPI,
Hmm.
and the accuracy of the written income limit estimator as you get closer becomes more a function of how variable is CPI.
Yeah,
And if CPI surprises, and for a number of years, CPI wasn't that surprising.
right. Well, it's funny, we're going to totally digress and go off script here for a minute, but when we look at our estimates that we're doing from 2015 to about 2019, this change in CPI would sometimes result in maybe a $50 variance at the 50% level, right? So
Right.
0.01% variance. Then when COVID hit, CPI became so much more variable. We had a lot more variation in our estimates because we were kind of chasing CPI and trying to figure out what was going to happen. But now, kind of post COVID, we look at the variance in the CPI from the various CBO estimates that come out, and it's very minor tweaks. So we're kind of back to that, hopefully more accurate estimates
Right.
because CPI is less variable. Now I realize I'm saying that in an election year, so who knows? But yeah,
Okay. Let me, well, actually, there was something else that you mentioned earlier before we get on to fair market rents. Uh, and that was HUD changing its methodology
yes,
potentially. And, every time, as you mentioned back in 2023, I mean, HUD had to change the methodology because the COVID data from 2020 wasn't very good, the ACS data. And then there's been changes to the way the cap is calculated. And then there was the imposition of an overall 10% cap. Are you expecting any changes to the formula this year?
yeah. So looking back, there has been a lot of changes over the last few years, and mainly kind of HUD responding to this unprecedented time. But when I look at the data this year, I don't really foresee anything that HUD is going to want to be reactionary to, right? We're having kind of fairly nice, steady increase. We're seeing about 10% of the areas capped, which is kind of, I think, where HUD wants. He wants to cap, they want to cap outliers. So, and the other thing is, you mentioned this pandemic issue with the 2020 data. That's what kind of generated our income limits working group, where we kind of interface with HUD. And HUD's been very good about kind of signaling to our group when there's going to be changes, and has been very open about coming and talking to our group during our working group meetings. And so, kind of in these interactions with HUD, we haven't really gotten a sense that they're looking to tweak anything. Now, I will say that HUD is very interested in the cap, and they're very interested in whether or not their CPI estimate is accurate. So again, I look and say, well, they nailed the 2023 with using the CPI. So I don't see anything in the data that's telling me that HUD wants to make a change now, or that needs to make a change. So I'd be very surprised if there was any sort of, especially any large change. I'd be very surprised.
Great. Thank you for that. Now, let's talk about fair market rent levels. They are another factor in calculating income limits in high cost areas. What can you share about fair market rents this year and what impact it might have over what percentage of areas?
Yeah. So fair market rents actually had fairly kind of steady growth again. I think there was some concern that fair market rents would kind of have more decreases this year because we had this big ramp in rents, and rents have kind of tailed off or slowed down in some markets. But 88% of areas have an increase, and that covers 86% of the population. But on the flip side, 12% of areas do have an increase. But when we kind of again look at this weighted average change, it's right around 4.4%. So if you kind of look at it, you'd say, well, the FMRs are kind of increasing at a similar rate of income limits. And so because of that, the number of areas that are subject to this high housing cost adjustment are looking to stay fairly stagnant. And again, we're going to have kind of fairly similar increases caused by fair market rents. And just to kind of inform people a little more, this is very different than what we saw the last 2 years. Fair market rents had increases of over 10% in 24 and 23 fair market rents. And so this is and that drove a lot of big increases in high housing cost areas. So this year we're going to see high housing cost areas increasing more in line with what's happening with the rest of the areas across the country and income limits.
Great. Thank you for that. And while we're on the topic of fair market rents, we can maybe this is one of the two bonus topics. And one of the notable changes with the fair market rent release is that more areas are broken down into smaller areas to determine fair market rents. And our listeners probably wondering, well, when you take a larger area that was where the fair market rent was determined over the whole area, and you break it down to a smaller area fair market rents, what might you call that? You call that small area fair market rents. So, and more specifically, this for fiscal year 2025, 41 additional metropolitan areas. Now you must use the small area fair market rents. And that's once again, that's for setting voucher rents. And of course, the purpose of using smaller area fair market rents is so that the voucher rent levels can be more localized in terms of what that percentile rent is. Because obviously in a large metropolitan area, you can have pretty disparate rent levels across the various communities within the larger metropolitan area. Please, with that as background, Thomas, please share more insights that you discerned from the additional 41 areas that now will be using small area fair market rents.
Yeah, so hopefully most of us are kind of have heard the concept of small area fair market rents before, and this is HUD's way of helping kind of decentralize poverty. So they were saying that in a lot of areas, the voucher rent, when you look at the voucher across the entire county or metropolitan area, is not enough to move into some of the areas that have higher opportunities. And so the small area fair market rents are set so that a tenant with a voucher, if they're looking at an area with a higher opportunity, should theoretically have a higher small area fair market rent, and so they can afford to live in an area that has higher opportunities. And so if you look across, I think Los Angeles is a great example of this because people are kind of familiar with some of the iconic areas, right? You'd imagine the fair market rent in 90210 Beverly Hills is quite different than the fair market rent maybe closer to the valley. And so this helps tenants be able to move to areas that have higher opportunities. But if we kind of look at this from a tax credit lens, right? Well, first, if we look at just from voucher holders, it's great they can move to areas with more opportunity. They can afford to live in different areas of the county than maybe they couldn't before. Again, looking at LA, the difference between the highest fair market rent, which I think is around 3,200, and the lowest, which is around 1,800, is a huge spread within the same county because Los Angeles is such a disparate income distribution throughout its area. And so what's great about this is those tenants can use their vouchers, but what's great about it for our tax credit projects is hopefully through the state QAPs and other things, we are building projects in areas of higher opportunities. And so therefore the voucher rents for our zip codes in these areas that are using small area FMRs should also see a corresponding increase. And so now when you're working with your PHA to move in tenants who have Section 8 vouchers, you should be able to set a contract rent that's more in line with the market rent for your area and be able to help, as we've talked, all the things we talked about, help with your debt service, help with maintenance, help with budgeting on your project and all those things. So it's helpful. Now, again, on the flip side, if you have projects that are in zip codes that are kind of below average for the area or below average rents, then you might see actually a decrease in your small area FMRs. And that might set off alarm bells for people. But good news is there is a hold harmless where when you shift to small area FMRs, PHAs first off are not required to implement these decreases. And then there is actually a time period where they can implement them over a little bit of time. And existing tenants are held harmless. And then for new tenants, it steps down over time. And so you won't feel this impact immediately. And again, you can kind of work with budgeting, et cetera, if you're aware of this.
So I mentioned 41, I think it was 41 additional metropolitan areas must use small area for market rents. We're not going to go into all 41, but there are a couple of larger areas that you would like to point out to the audience.
I was kind of hoping you were going to have AI read all 41 to listeners here. But no, some of the bigger areas that you'd recognize: Detroit, Los Angeles, Miami, Orlando, Phoenix, San Jose, Seattle, St. Louis, Tucson. There's a lot of big areas you'd recognize. I guess you have to mention Kansas City since they dominate football these days. So Kansas City as well are all going to be picked up in this.
Right. Thank you for that. I thought you mentioned Kansas City because that's just where we had our Restore Attachment conference last week.
That too, of course. But by the time we air, it'll be 2 weeks ago. So
that is correct. That is correct. And I will have been to the Kansas City, the Kansas City Niners game, and we'll see if that plays out for me.
Hopefully better than it played out for Seattle this last week versus.
And then, if you wanted to share anything more, I feel like you kind of shared some of the effect that the shift to small area for micro rents would have on the areas. Anything else you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, no, I think that I kind of got ahead of myself and talked about that already. And so
Okay.
I don't think there's more to kind of dig in on that.
Great. Thank you. The other bonus topic that I mentioned in the intro, and I want to briefly address here, and that has to do with rent control coming to all California LIHTC properties. And that's because Governor Gavin Newsom signed legislation a couple of weeks ago now that imposes rent control on all LIHTC finance properties in California. As many listeners and viewers may know, California Tax Allocation Committee did create a rent control for future LIHTC properties, along with a look back rule. This legislation basically goes to TCAC and says apply to all properties. And you might be thinking, this podcast is a national podcast, California, great, California is just one state, but obviously California as a state, it punches above its weight, you might say. They're a very large state and is home to roughly 10% of all low income tax credit homes in the nation. I didn't calculate the exact number, but California is obviously a large population base, so has large amounts of 9% credits, and also uses virtually all of its productivity bonds for low income tax credit housing. So it's definitely producing a lot of homes disproportionate to other states. And oftentimes what starts in California spreads to the rest of the nation. So with that as background, Thomas, if you could share more than what I did in the introduction of the question as to the effect of this new law on affordable housing and rent limits in California.
Yeah. So as Mike said, they've already passed rent control for new projects. So let's talk a little bit about what they've done and how that might impact future projects.
Right.
So first off, the really key piece of this rent control is that it's done at a tenant by tenant level, as opposed to the HUD cap that's done on income limits in general. But if you weren't charging max, you can increase the rent on any given tenant, whatever percentage it takes to get up to the max. But this new legislation looks at, or the TCAC regulatory change caps the increases on individual households. So if a unit becomes vacant, you're allowed to take the rent up to the max. So it's really true rent control in the sense that it's based on the residents living in the home at that time. And the cap is the lesser of 10%. So this 10% ceiling should look familiar to you, but it's a lesser of 10% or 5% plus the change in CPI for that area. And so this can be different than what the HUD income limit is. And so we run into a couple issues. Number one, if you're in a property that was charging max from the beginning, you could have a max HUD increase that's greater than the allowed increase in California. And so you would not be able to go up to the HUD max. You'd be subject to the California max increase. And so you start to get a gap between you and HUD. And we haven't had this for enough years to see if over time, if it kind of will ever catch up. But as long as that tenant's in there, you're going to be subject to those increases on that specific household, which I think kind of raises some interesting questions, because now are you forced to always increase to the max? We talked earlier about we try to be mindful of our increases and phase them in over years and things like that. But with this new limitation, if you don't increase in any given year, you have no catch up in the future. So it's kind of interesting what we'll see come out of that, but I kind of digress as we kind of look at the implications. But right now, that regulation only applies to new allocations after April of this year and a certain 5-year look back. But the law that was just signed by Gavin Newsom says TCAC, you have till June 30th of next year to develop a policy that's going to apply to every single project that has a regulatory agreement with you, TCAC. And so it's going to reach a much bigger population now. And so what we don't know is, what is TCAC going to do? Are they going to say, well, our existing policy seems to be working, so let's just take our existing policy and apply it to a bigger population? Or are they going to say, well, now that we kind of have this legislative mandate, let's dig in a little bit deeper and maybe do a different policy? And I don't think they do a different policy for the two different cohorts of units. I think whatever they end up changing here would likely apply to all projects. But I think that there is some, I don't know if I would say risk, but there's some discussion that TCAC could potentially do something different. But also on the flip side, they might say, look, we just went through this regulatory process. We all thought this was a good idea for new properties, so why not just expand this same one? So we don't know. I would say if I was handicapping it, which I'm not sure why I'm handicapping it here, I'd say 75%, they'd probably keep what they have and 25% implement something new.
And I believe they have, is it till May of next year to come out, or do you recall the deadline?
I thought it was June 30th.
June 30th. Okay.
Because if you look at the rent cap increases, it's on this weird July window. And so that's why I believe it's June 30th, so that it can apply for that July 1st window.
Great. Thank you for that. So anything, actually, before we close, anything else you wanted to add on the income and rent limits?
Yeah, so I think that when we're just kind of looking at, okay, Thomas, this has been great, but what are some next key dates I should be thinking about? Number one, as I alluded to, the 5-year ACS data is going to come out in December, so we'll be rerunning our estimates for that. Obviously, we'll have a CPI release in hopefully January or February, so we'll rerun the limits for that. And then income limits should come out in April. But as I always say, if you find this discussion interesting and you want to have kind of more discussions like this, is you should really look at joining our income limits working group. The income limits working group has a great group of people who are really focused on income limits, and we have great discussions in our meetings. This meeting, we went back into much more detail on all the things we talked about on this podcast and dug more into some of the reasons why things are happening. So I mentioned HUD tends to join us right after the income limits release to talk about it. They also tend to join us if they announce any changes and kind of talk to our group about that. We also submit comment letters. We submitted comments letters on the California rent change. We submitted comments letter, obviously, on the cap language that's changed over the last few years. So it's a very kind of active group around, and we say income limits, but it's really any sort of HUD data. We've commented on fair market rents before. We've commented on the impact of income limits on QCTs and DDAs. So it's an all-encompassing group. So if there's something you're interested in, definitely reach out. I'm sure Mike will tell us that he'll put the link in the show notes to the page. But yeah, that'd be kind of what I'd be thinking forward to if I was found this income limit discussion interesting.
And I would second that, Thomas.
Oh,
I sort of feel like every major owner of LIHTC properties or property managers or investors should have someone who on the team that's members of this income limits working group, because I mean, this is what's determining the income growth or lack of growth on your portfolio of properties.
yeah.
And gaining
And
insights into what's coming is really valuable. The ability to make comments on to try to influence what's coming is really valuable. And then just as you mentioned, a lot of the discussion we have on those calls, such as the California rent control provision, how it applies, it can get a bit weedy, but someone in your organization should be in the weeds.
yeah, and I would almost go a step further and say, even if you think this stuff is boring, you know that it's important. And so even if you don't personally have somebody you want to join, just helping to underwrite these efforts so we can write these comment letters, so we can interface with HUD also helps, even if there's not somebody in your organization who you want to dedicate attending the meetings.
No, that's a excellent point. That's exactly right. So before we wrap up with and get to the off mic section, I did want you to share with our audience other resources and say a little bit more about the rent income limits estimator, because we've
Yeah.
referenced it, but haven't discussed it in the detail that it deserves.
Yeah, so the rent income limit estimator, right? As soon as we get the ACS data, we start cranking out our estimates and we release them on our website. You can go to our website, you can order individual areas. So if you're just kind of focused on one area, you can go order that area and see what we're estimating the change will be for the income and rent. Also, if you're kind of one of our power users, you can buy the entire database of all right now 1,500 areas. So you can really sort and look at the entire country. And we do kind of update this as new information comes out. So, right now, the timing of when fair market rents released, they released so early this year that that update happened at the same time, but sometimes it happens at different times. If we get new information from HUD as what they're doing with the caps, we're re-update our estimate and rerun it. So the estimator is a great tool. You can link to that you can order directly on our website. If you're looking at doing a bulk purchase, you can reach out to me directly and we can talk about that as well.
Right. Thank you. And then I also would note for additional resources to our audience, they can look to Thomas's various blog posts, and I'll post some links to some of those. And we do have a rent and income limits calculator on our website that provides the historical information. And then if you want to see Thomas in person, please join us at our LIHTC conference in Las Vegas, December 5th and 6th. We hope to have the results of the presidential election and the congressional elections by then, so we can talk a lot about the possibilities that the new administration and the new Congress might provide in the low income tax credit space and affordable housing space more generally. And I like to say I do have a prediction for the elections. Either Republicans will sweep, the Democrats will sweep or we'll have divided government. And right now, a lot of my presentations discuss all three scenarios, but by December, we should know one scenario and we'll be focused on that. So Thomas, thank you for being on the podcast today. I'll share links to all of the various items that you mentioned. And we'll also include your contact information so that those who are joining us today and have a question for you, they can reach out to you. And then before we get to our off mic section, I wanted to remind our listeners and viewers to subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform or platforms you prefer. And also I encourage you to share the podcast with your colleagues who may also be interested in the content. So Thomas, now I wanted to turn to the off mic section. So I will, and this is a fun segment where we get to acknowledge our industry colleagues. So Thomas, I wanted you to share an industry shout out, please.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a shout out today to Missy Covington, who's the VP of Compliance at Raymond James Affordable Housing. She's just a great resource when we have technical issues. We bounce them off of each other, and she always has really good insight and questions for me and back and forth. So I give her a shout out. And the other reason why I'm giving her a shout out is she works for Raymond James, so she's right there in Tampa Bay, and just giving a kind of by proxy shout out to all those who are impacted by the hurricanes, and let them know that our thoughts are with them and we're thinking about, what we can do to help them.
Great. Thank you for that, Thomas. And I echo your shout out to Missy. And I hope you're doing well, and Raymond James and others in Tampa Bay are doing as well as they can in the midst of the hurricane disaster. So thank you, Thomas. And to our listeners, I'm Mike Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.